Eddie Van Halen revolutionized the guitar, inspired millions, and redefined rock itself. But behind his infectious grin and mind-bending solos lay rivalries few ever knew about. There were guitarists he admired, competed with, and at times couldn't stand. What drove this hidden tension between legends? Let's find out. Before Eruption, before the screaming crowds, a teenage Eddie Van Halen was sitting in his Pasadena bedroom with a cheap guitar and a worn stack of Cream records. Night after night, he dropped the needle on Crossroads, trying to capture every bend and fiery lick from Eric Clapton's playing. Clapton wasn't just an influence. He was the reason Eddie picked up the guitar in the first place. He once told Guitar World that Clapton was his main influence, that he would sit for hours trying to figure out what he was doing, playing that Crossroads solo note for note. He called him God. In those early years, Eddie didn't care about fame or tone or songwriting. He wanted to understand what made Clapton's playing feel alive. But time changes everything. By the late 70s, Eddie had done something even Clapton hadn't. He reinvented the electric guitar entirely. When Eruption hit, it sounded like it came from another world. His two-handed tapping, harmonic squeals, and dive bombs redefined guitar technique overnight. But not everyone cheered. In 1980, when Clapton was asked about Van Halen, his response stunned Eddie. He said Eddie was very good technically, but that he didn't hear much soul. It was a casual remark, but it cut deep. For Eddie, it was heartbreaking. The man who had shaped his entire style now dismissed his music as mechanical. Years later, Eddie admitted it kind of broke his heart, that he wasn't trying to outplay Clapton. He was inspired by him. And to hear that Clapton didn't like what he was doing really got to him. Part of the clash came down to philosophy. Clapton's guitar work was built on restraint and blues-rooted feeling. Eddie's was about freedom, distortion, and fearless experimentation. They represented two different eras entirely. Yet even through the pain, the admiration never faded. Eddie later said that Clapton's tone on Crossroads was still untouchable, that it was pure feeling, and you simply couldn't fake that. A similar sting came from Ritchie Blackmore, the moody genius behind Deep Purple and Rainbow. For a teenage Eddie, Blackmore wasn't just another rock star. He was a prophet of tone. Eddie would study Burn and Highway Star note for note, replaying them until his fingers bled. But the dream soured quickly when he finally got the chance to meet one of his gods in person. Eddie recalled the encounter clearly. Blackmore just stared at him. Wouldn't say hi, nothing. He was crushed. He had looked up to this man his whole life, and he just blew him off. That silence hit harder than any insult. Years later, when Blackmore was asked what he thought of Van Halen, his response felt like both a compliment and a jab. He said Eddie was a fine player, but that he played too many notes. It revealed a deeper divide between two eras of rock guitar. Blackmore's style was shaped by classical phrasing and restraint. Eddie's playing was the opposite, fluid, explosive, and completely unbound. Still, Eddie never turned that cold encounter into lasting bitterness, saying he was probably just too sensitive, and that maybe Blackmore was shy or didn't know what to say. Over time, even Ritchie softened, eventually admitting that Eddie had brought something genuinely new and had found his own voice. Then there was Joe Perry of Aerosmith. Eddie recalled how that early tour period felt, saying that people like Perry would just give him the shaft with their eyes, wouldn't say hello, wouldn't be nice, nothing. Imagine being the young prodigy on the road, playing with everything you have night after night, and when you finally bump into the heroes whose posters hung on your wall, they don't even look your way. Eddie felt that Perry and others saw him as a threat, that they wouldn't go out of their way to help anyone because they felt threatened. It was an honest read of the generational shift happening in the late 70s. His style had redrawn the map of electric guitar playing, and the old guard wasn't comfortable with it. Ironically, years later, Perry completely reversed his stance. In 2013, he looked back with open admiration, saying Eddie took everything he'd heard and put his own stamp on it, that he had reinvented guitar playing altogether, and that he personally had been blown away the first time he heard the debut album. A different kind of frustration came from Tom Scholz of Boston. Eddie recalled playing a show on the same bill, finishing his solo to a roaring crowd, and then watching Scholz step up and essentially play his solo right back at him. The whole crowd was looking at Eddie like they couldn't figure out what was happening. What made it worse was that Scholz was famously aloof backstage, never coming around, never saying hi, just disappearing after the show. The mix of imitation and aloofness stung. Scholz was the opposite of Eddie in almost every way, a perfectionist engineer with an MIT degree who built his own gear and recorded Boston's debut album in his basement. Where Eddie played by instinct, Scholz calibrated by science. To Eddie, originality wasn't optional, it was sacred. He'd built his guitar by hand, soldering pickups and sawing bodies until he found his own voice. Seeing someone mirror, that sound felt deeply personal. He later said there's a difference between inspiration and duplication, that you can be inspired by someone's playing, but if you don't evolve, you're just tracing someone else's shadow. Perhaps the most personal slight came from Rick Derringer. It was 1978, Van Halen was exploding, and Derringer was opening for them on tour, a veteran Eddie had genuinely grown up admiring. But after a show one night, Eddie walked up to Derringer and told him straight that he couldn't copy his melody. He made clear he didn't mind the technique being borrowed, but playing his actual solo note for note in front of the same audience crossed a line. The next night, Derringer did it again, same notes, same phrasing, even closing with "You Really Got Me," a song Van Halen had already made their own live anthem. Eddie's patience snapped. He told Derringer directly that if he was going to keep doing that, he wasn't opening for them anymore. And just like that, Derringer was off the tour. For Eddie, it wasn't about ego. It was about identity. His sound was the heart of everything Van Halen was building, and watching someone he respected replicate it so bluntly felt like theft. As he put it simply, you can copy the licks, but not the spirit. And that's what music is. Spirit. But of all the rivalries in Eddie's career, the one with Randy Rhoads carried the most weight. In the early 80s, two guitar prodigies stood at the center of rock storm. Eddie Van Halen and Randy Rhoads. Both were young, both were revolutionizing guitar playing, and both were being endlessly compared. In archived audio, Eddie reflected on Rhoads with words that were sharp and layered, part compliment, part challenge. He acknowledged that Rhoads was good, but said he didn't think he did anything Eddie hadn't already done. Ozzy Osbourne pushed back on that directly, saying Eddie had not taught Randy his licks, and that the two were simply rivals. That word captures it perfectly. This was an open war. It was cold competition. Both knew the other was brilliant. There's even a story that Rhoads' guitar tech once taped a photo of Eddie to the bottom of Randy's wah pedal, so that every time Rhoads stepped on it, he was literally stepping on Eddie. Half joke, half symbol. Beneath Eddie's frustration lay something deeply human: vulnerability. He was a man who had changed the language of rock guitar and was suddenly hearing that language spoken back at him by someone else. And then, tragically, Randy Rhoads was gone, killed in a plane crash in 1982, and the rivalry was frozen in time forever. In later interviews, when Eddie revisited Rhoads, the bite was gone, replaced by quiet reflection. Maybe he understood that rivalry and respect were two sides of the same coin. Maybe he saw too much of himself in Randy, and that reflection was both admiration and discomfort in equal measure. What all of these relationships reveal is something far more interesting than simple hatred. Eddie Van Halen was a man who loved music so deeply and worked so hard to find his own voice that any threat to its originality felt personal. He didn't hate these men. He admired most of them, but he competed with them, was hurt by some of them, and was copied by others. And through all of it, he kept playing, not for approval, not for rivalry, but because the guitar was the only place where everything truly made sense.